So hello and welcome back to Climbing Mount Sophia. Today I'm with Ryan Barton. Ryan, thank you for coming and chatting with me today. Ryan works currently, he is are you the president?
Executive director.
Executive
Yeah.
director of the Vervaeke Foundation. So he works closely with John Vervaeke, who anyone who watches my channel, I would imagine, knows well. And so we've been dialoguing a little bit, and we've been talking about the notion of prayer. And so we're hoping to dive into that a little bit today. But Ryan, maybe if you want to just kind of introduce yourself a little bit and maybe tell a little bit about your background and maybe especially in relation to prayer.
Yeah. Thanks, Ken. I've been looking forward to this conversation because I'm eager to wrestle with prayer and really like reclaim it and elevate it and look at it from the perspective of both like Orthodox Christianity, understanding my story, and then the wisdom practices and wisdom cultivation that we get so richly from John and others. And so, for me, I grew up in a homeschooled, what I would consider fundamentalist evangelical environment. And I remember asking my dad, like, Dad, why do I pray like for all these people? Like God already knows that they have needs. And the answer was like, well, because, God wants to spend time with you. And I was like, wait, like, and I remember as a kid, that answer was very unsatisfying. And it was very much like, wait, isn't he here and in these different places? And when I got into a Pentecostal church as a teenager, and the glossolalia, the sort of intense spiritual experiences that come with that, but also some of the sort of chaotic emotionalism, you might say, and I've always had this hunger for like, where is real transformation? Like, where's where's something deeply meaningful? And so that actually led me to join a community called the International House of Prayer out in Kansas City. Are you familiar with them? You're smiling. Yeah.
Yeah. I have some good friends that were a part of that for some time.
Oh, interesting. Well,
Yeah.
I have to. That's fascinating. We
Yeah.
probably know some people in common. And so, and that was a 24/7 prayer, as you know. It was like prayer and worship round the clock. And it was really this sense of like, we are putting a bullseye on the rooftop of this place. Like, we are going to have a move of the spirit that starts here. You have this beautiful commitment. I mean, this intensity and this sort of ideal young, these idealized young people where we're like, we're going to sacrifice, and like this desire to sacrifice for God, this desire to sacrifice in a beautiful way that I really appreciated, but it got really twisted really quickly. And I remember just like, you're praying and suffering, like in the middle of the night, and, commitment, and you're poor and you're doing all these things to try to get God to do something. And there was this constant waiting on God, and this constant, like, when is he going to do it? And is it enough? And then they added fasting in. And I remember there was a season where like I would fast 3 days at the beginning of every month, and then like every Tuesday. And then they were encouraging like 2 days a week. And I realized I started to hate God. Like I started to feel guilty every time I did something pleasurable, because it's like, I'm not sacrificing enough. I'm not praying enough. I'm not fasting enough. And I was like, I got to get out of this. Like, this is not healthy. This is not well. And I would say then, the next sort of 20 years of my life, I spent building a business and a family and wrestling with theology. And that wrestling led to depth therapy that led to sort of like, how do we live in embodied ways that are pursuing the good in a real like contact way, that led me to John Vervaeke's work, which has been such a gift. And so now I have all these rich wisdom practices, this rich ecology that's so life-giving.
Yeah.
And what I feel like is a fairly insipid prayer life, and a real hesitation and concern around. So I have this challenge, which is that like, if you hold aside that prayer like causes God to do something, if you say, no, prayer never causes God to do something, you're kind of at odds with the entire Christian tradition.
Right.
And yet by doing so, it feels like there is something of unintelligibility of reality that breaks the beauty of reality and the intelligibility of it. And there's something about this intersection that I'm wrestling with, and like, okay, what is prayer? Can I really understand and wrestle with it as sort of a wisdom, as its own transformation of me? And then what else is the mystery of prayer? And how can I understand and sort of bring this in that is both scientifically rigorous and is looking at it from the lens of orthodoxy? Okay, that was a lot. That might have been more than you asked for.
No, thank you. That was great, actually. That was fantastic. Because I think, okay, so let me try to pull out a couple things that really hit me. So there's this childhood stage where prayer is this kind of this petitioning for others, almost was how I heard it. But that felt disconnected, because it felt as if, well, do I have some kind of connection to God that they don't, or something? Why would I be doing this? What is happening there? And there wasn't really anything satisfactory. And then later on, then it became, oh, it's the experience. Oh, yes. Like, oh, God is showering me with, and I'm in the, and then it's too much. And then it's this hard ascetic where it's, but that's an interesting one at the house of prayer, like you talked about, because it's very ascetic, sorry, in this fasting and commitment and this discipline. But it's this prayer for, right? There's an expectation for a specified end.
Yes.
Right. It's toward an end that is predicated in some sense on our modeling, right? You're already, right. We've already presumed what should be, right. And
well said.
And we're attempting to give rise to the necessary energy to make that happen, or something, maybe.
I think that's well articulated. I used to sometimes, as I became disenchanted with that, and then of course, once you become disenchanted with something that you've gone very far into, you recognize that note in lots of places, of other places.
Yeah.
But that, the ancient Hebrew story of the prophet Elijah and the prophets of Baal, that like they were the ones who were slashing and shouting and trying to get the heavens to move, and he was coming in a quiet confidence that there was some deeper rationality that he was connected to that didn't require all of that. And there was something of like this prayer to get God to move that feels like you're, like you say, you've already determined that the good. And then you're trying to get this invisible entity to move on your behalf that you never really know, was it him or was it not? And what rules are that? Like, it ultimately ends up being beyond logic in a way that was very unsettling to my ability to live a coherent life.
Okay. So prayer was in some sense almost fundamentally a disconnecting practice for you.
That's a really good insight, because I would say that I didn't mean to interrupt your train of insight. That because one of my own emotional challenges in life, my own sort of the areas where life has been psychically overwhelming for me, when I have prayed for rescue, it has bred more of a like, I need to rely on someone else who is not doing it for me. And when I said, screw it, like, this is mine. Like, I own my shadow. I've got to wrestle with this thing. I've got to do the hard work. Like, how do I? And of course, that then can engender a place of mindfulness, a place of agency, a fresh perspective of going in the tools. And then the transformation happens. And it's like, well, interesting that prayer for me was actually a way of like pushing the problems of my shadow onto another being, and then waiting, and like, okay, that's obviously not what it's supposed to be, right? Like, that's not enculturating the right state of being within me.
Yeah. And I think, at least in my experience, not only does my personal experience, but I think also broadly culturally resonates with what you're sharing here, because I think one of the most common kind of frustrations that I'll hear from people, or that I experienced myself, in my case, when I was 12 years old, my dad had cancer, and they told us he was going to die. And at that point, that was what I knew, right? And so we all were praying about it, and wonderfully, my dad actually made it through and survived. So maybe I didn't have quite the same trauma that some other people that I know well do have, which is, hey, my family member, my child is sick, and I'm praying and I'm praying and I'm praying. And not only do they get worse, they actually die.
It's a real problem. Yes.
And that is a pervasive issue.
Yes.
I've yet to hear a sufficient response from what I'll say is the evangelical community,
Mhm.
But I think it has to do with this. I think it has to do with what you put your finger on here, which is that prayer in this way has a disconnecting element to it, where there's it 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 places it's a loss of agency on my end.
A displacement of agency, even.
Yeah, yeah, but of course, it's a displacement to the degree that I don't understand who God actually is,
Hmm.
and how God actually interacts with reality. I actually displace my agency onto something that I don't know what it is. It's not real,
Yes.
right? And that's what people come away with, right? Like
Yeah.
people come away with, well, God was not real.
Yeah. That's very well said. I'm really struck by that, because there was a point in my life where, when you start to zoom out and you wrestle with, there are 40,000 denominations, and there are so many different ways of seeing, and then everyone's sort of personal interpretation of God, and you start to overlay that on what you and I are wrestling with, it can be a bit insanity giving of, how do I know which is the right way, and when I've prayed enough, or when I've prayed in the right way. And ultimately, there's been a sort of shift psychically for me of, I will trust the true, the good, and the beautiful. And the God that is beyond them is the mystery beyond, that is the
Mm.
source of the true, the good, and the beautiful, but can't be in conflict with it. And that's
Mm.
a bit of a life wager for me, that God must be the author and origin of the true, good, and beautiful if God exists.
Mm.
Otherwise, the fundamental ground of being is at odds with that being. Like, that doesn't make sense, right?
Yes. Yeah. Okay. So yeah. Yes. This is exactly okay. This notion, right? This notion that there can be things happening in nature that are against the will of God, right?
Yes.
Like
Yes.
like this way of perceiving it as if God is here and nature is here and they're in
Yes.
conflict with each other, right? There's a fundamental presupposition in this way we've been describing prayer that has that at its core, right? And I just had this conversation with John Vervaeke and DC Schindler, and Schindler said this wonderful thing. Let me see if I can get it right. He says, in classical theology and Christianity, to prove the being of God, they would point to the order of the cosmos. And in the modern conception of God, it's often that people will point to places where the cosmos seems to be disturbed from its order to prove God.
Wow.
Right?
Wow.
Point to a miracle, right? You point to this disturbance, point to this, big shift thing, right? But the underlying substrate, well, that's just kind of happening, and God somehow just intervenes occasionally.
I'm really struck by the dualism of what you're describing, and the separation in that, and the evidence of God being the disturbance of, in a way, the true, the good, and the beautiful, of the natural order of things, of the logos, of which Christ was the embodiment. It, rather than that, than the logos being the constant witness and the constant pointing towards Christ.
Right. Right. And if that's the kind of God that you're praying to, right? If that's your kind of conceptualization of the relationship of what we refer to with this word God and reality as it unfolds itself to us, if our presupposition of that relationship is adversarial, then necessarily our prayers will be of a nature to disconnect us from reality, because we're actually attempting to incite and a violence from God onto nature, right? Nature is taking its course, and we're requesting that an imposition of force change.
I think that's very well explicated. And I think that that is a really beautiful, like zooming into my personal story and how that feels.
Mm,
And then out to the common experience of prayer didn't solve it. And now I'm bitter at God, which
mhm.
you can then add some scientific data to, which is that Christians die in natural disasters at the same rate as those who are not Christians, right? Like those who pray and those who do not seem to die in wars and die in natural disasters at the same levels.
Yeah.
And so we're actually, there is something else at work here. Now,
Mm.
that doesn't mean then that we just discount prayer and like, oh, like this has no value, but it clearly is not what we have been taught and what culturally I think it's often held to be, as you just well explicated.
Oh, well, thank you. Yeah, no, I agree. And I think so. So how does that feel? Does that feel like that kind of that disconnecting kind of frame and God versus nature? Does that kind of feel, it sounds like that fits for you a little bit.
Yeah, it resonates deeply. Does it for you as well?
Yeah. Yeah, because this is something that for me, I continue, it continues to be a difficulty, because these are the kinds of things, right, that you can see them, you can work through them, and they go away, and then they come back all of a sudden, right? And I realize, oh no, I've been treating it in this way that I used to treat it. But this prayer is as God as kind of some cosmic, genie or vending machine or something.
Mm-hmm.
But so what might be a more real, let's take it then. Let's take it that we have adequately problematized the modern notion of prayer. And so how might we reconceptualize what prayer is?
Okay, let me propose a model. I sort of earlier had this sense of left and right of like prayer as a way of transforming self, prayer as a way of causing God to have some agentic role in the world.
Mm-hmm.
And perhaps we should like flip that and think hierarchical, like top and bottom instead. And I think if we can work our way from the bottom up, there's no question that prayer is a powerful self-transformative wisdom practice that has incredible depths. I mean, you only have to read the mystics, right, to realize like, whoa, this can take people places that I've never been able to touch through prayer.
Yeah.
Even Oswald Chambers in Mount Most Highest, I remember reading that when I was young, and he was like, it's not so much that prayer changes things, it's that prayer changes me and I change things. And that really got into my young teenage head when I read that. And I
Nice.
think there is something like, there are a lot of things that we could say that prayer is. Like one is an orienting of our hierarchy of value, of setting the highest conceived hierarchy value. Note the Petersonian language there.
Yeah.
Like two as our attention,
Yeah.
and addressing our attention to that. So like when I say the Lord's Prayer in the morning, when I wake up, I try to take that attitude as like the highest good that I can conceive of. And that is orienting my attention for the day.
Yeah.
And then I think it is clearly a practice of, I mean, there are so many practices of prayer and so much rich. And I've been reading, Balthazar and Tim Keller and Lewis, and like trying to really understand and starting to split out, like even mapping them to wisdom practices of like, oh, interesting. Here is a way of quieting the body and the mind,
Yeah.
and coming into sort of a meditative prayer. Here is a way of contemplating and actually looking through the lens of theology and relationship with God into life.
Yeah.
Here is a stilling and an insight kind of prayer where I'm actually like bringing requests before the Lord and saying, okay, this is what I'm wrestling with. That's very ordering and organizing. And there's all of these, and there's a confession, right? That's a very self-reflective, humble practice of confession. And I think all of those things, one could characterize them. And please, I'm saying this not in any way to like say that these are equivalent in value, but like to say that prayer as a wisdom practice has all kinds of rich tradition. And I think that framing helps us to see prayer as a practice and a discipline, the way that meditation is, and to go deeper into the depths of it. How does that land for you?
I like that a lot. One thing that I've noticed as a theme throughout that was that it's not as if it's an exchange of information between agents. Right? that's like a difference. Like,
So yeah, we'll continue.
well, in the way you're talking about it now, there's this okay, I'll use the language that we talked about earlier, right? Prayer was a means to an end.
Mhm.
That was postulated, and you're almost like trying to get God to help you along or do it for you, right? Accomplish this end. And now it's a different kind of thing in the way you've proposed, that there's it's not as if God is an agent to whom I am trying to transfer information or trying to get information from. It's that there's a binding into what's already there through various means, right? Like I bring in this confession aspect, I bring in this contemplation aspect and this meditation aspect, and finally maybe a request aspect. But I even, like, in the order that you explicated those, right? You had a meditation, a contemplation, and then you move to the theological, and then you move to say the practical, right? And so it starts with a receptivity, which brings you into a sort of connectedness, right? Looking through the lenses of different theological aspects, you bring your mind on board to connect into the world, and then you move forward, right? Now, and then you deal with your sin, right, in this confession kind of place, right? Like, and then you can actually ask, like, for things. And so there's this fundamental grounding that starts with a movement upward and inward, like at the same time almost. That's what I'm hearing from you.
I very much like how you articulated that, and I think that's the movement that I'm sort of proposing as one way of seeing prayer, starting from the bottom up, of like saying what it is at minimum, from let's starting from a naturalistic frame, right? And saying, okay, let's take this from a naturalistic framing, and not saying we have to stop there, but okay, that's at least what it seems to me prayer is doing. And I would add one more, where you called out this motion up, and then this motion inward, and then sort of the motion back up in different ways. And I would say that I think prayer is also a motion out, especially if you use, the prayers of history and liturgical prayers. There's a deep connection to others in that place.
Yeah. And I obviously, growing up, I didn't do much prayer that was, a repetition of repetition of prayer in general, right? That automatically takes you out of our initial problematizing and into this other kind of place, where if you're doing repetitive prayer, say it's the Jesus prayer, it's already a kind of meditative practice. But I lost where I was going to go from there. Oh, when you pray these prayers that have been prayed by thousands over time, I don't know if this happens for you, but there have been times that I've in my prayer practice been saying particular prayers, where I swear I can hear, all those other people across history saying that prayer at the same time.
Awesome.
Right? There's like this note of it that just kind of like transcends the time difference and the space difference of all of those of us who have and are saying that prayer. And there's something wonderful about that kind of community. Like, you feel, I've felt so seen when that kind of thing has happened to me. I don't know if have you had any kind of experiences like that?
Hearing you, I both have resonance and aspiration lighting up. That has happened to some degree, but hearing how you described it, I'm not sure that deeply, but I aspire to that. Like, I think that is one of the beauty of praying a prayer that has been prayed by billions, right?
Yeah.
For now
Yeah.
thousands of years, or at least, millennium and a half for a lot of these. And there is something really beautiful and humbling and connective to that practice.
Mhm. How much do you find that like liturgical prayers like that are where you go to the most versus a more organic?
I would say that I am here because I am wrestling with all of this, and I really would love to hear your answer to that. I would say that I am more and more drawn to, like, my Catholic friends who have this rich tradition and prayers throughout the hours and through the days and the weeks and the seasons and the liturgical calendar that's baked in, that's so connected, and recognizing that prayer in this way, like really thinking of it as a transformative practice,
Mhm.
like coming up with my own words is very different than actually orbiting these words that have been honed by the collective intelligence of all of these people that it's been brought, that have been in the line to bring that to me. I think
Mm.
there's something really core about that. And then I would say that where I'm really trying to, so I'm trying to say, like, that to me is like kind of a core practice. And then, what I struggle with a little bit is that when it comes to meditation, contemplation, instantiating humility, love, etc., like a lot of the other practices, I just get to go so much deeper, so much faster. And I
Mm.
really like that I'm not sort of waiting for whether or not the spirit blows. It's like you actually just get to take it as a practice. And I say this like with a lot of humility, for not saying like, oh, it's I I just, when I read a book on centering prayer, and then I read a book from Zen Buddhism, like Zen Buddhism is like, if this happens, like, just push through. Here's the thing. Here's the practice. Here's what you do. In centering prayer, it's like, well, the Lord, like, the spirit didn't show up that day, and just keep waiting. And there's again that sort of agentic displacement that I find in that I makes me very drawn to just pure practice, like liturgical prayers and practices that I can go deeply in. But then I get sort of, well, hang on a second here. Like, where is the role for the spirit? Where is the role for that sort of, like, what does that mean and look like? And this is where we sort of work up that pyramid in a way that we outlined earlier, like starting naturalistically and then saying, okay, we get to what else is prayer.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, that was wonderful, because I think that's a lot of my answer too. Like, I am very much a novice when it comes to prayer. I I find, like so many things, the more I learn, the less I know, but for me, prayer, that sense of just kind of waiting for the spirit, right? And if the spirit doesn't come, well, it almost feels like it's a failure or something, right? And expectation is so bound up in the notion of prayer, I think, for
Mhm.
so many of us. And holding practices without expectation is a difficult thing, but I think you're right. I think it is easier from some of these other traditions, because
Mhm.
they explicitly tell you that the experience that you may have is not the point.
Right. You're actually supposed to let go of it.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that's there in Christianity at different points. But there's something in Christianity that's it's more inherently bounded towards some kind of expectation of change,
Mm-hmm.
um in a sort of straight, in a sort of obvious way.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think, and that has a lot of value, obviously, because we need to do that. But for me, I've found that the less expectation I have around my prayers, the more effective they seem to be, both in terms of reorienting myself and in terms of when it comes to requests in say even practical space. That I always have, thy kingdom come, thy will be done. That for me actually is the prayer that's when I think about pray without ceasing, that's what that is for me. And that's what I attempt to participate in my day-to-day life is, have little reminders to just have it running like a mantra in my head. To be honest with you, it's just thy kingdom come, thy will be done. Because like, I think there's a reason that is, in some sense, the Lord's Prayer, right? Like we have to talk about the Lord's Prayer because that's kind of like, that's got to be your cornerstone. And, our Father who is in heaven, hallowed be your name. That's just this opening up, I think, right? That's just this opening up to that which is beyond, right? That which is the beyond all things. And then the first move, having opened up, the first move is to say, thy kingdom come, thy will be done. And I think so much of prayer is like, prayer becomes a farce to the degree that is not. To the degree that principle is not participated in operative, I think it becomes a farce. Because I think that's the first, like if that's not your grounding for prayer as such, which is almost completely missing in, say, our initial problematization of modern prayer. If that's missing, it just, we get into all these strange places. So, yeah.
I love that. That's really helpful to me. I love what you did here. Like this, our Father is this ultimate opening, like to the edge of everything and beyond. And then immediately the posture of humility and alignment into that immediately recognizes that this is not a space where I am coming to transact. I am not a space coming with my stuff to then get, but instead a space of opening and centering and rooting and orienting towards reality, orienting towards he who is most real.
Yeah. And yes, and you can't have expectation after doing that. Right?
Agreed.
If that's participated, and I mean that in the fullest sense of the word, right? If that's participated, you don't run into the situation where, God chose not to answer my prayer.
So now you're lighting up for me that, this is actually like speaking into the ultimate frame that can break all other frames that we bring into this. And James Carse, whom I love, he wrote this book called The Silence of God on prayer. And it basically, he says, if God really speaks to you and like you have the voice of God, well, guess what? You're now a superhuman and everyone else is subhuman, and you're speaking to people who don't have the voice of God. And this is what happens in your relationship. He said, and ultimately the silence of God is the silence that you're giving to me now that affords a dialogue that is changing me. And you're providing a frame that I don't know. I can't know Ken well enough to know what these words are going to do. And so I am being transformed through the dialogue we were having that your silence is affording, and that God is the ultimate frame beyond all frames that affords that kind of transformation through the expected silence of a dialogue partner. And your opening that you've positioned in the Lord's Prayer is that connecting to the frame outside of all frames that breaks our cognitive framing and the way that we hold to say, even like whatever requests, whatever we think are important, that's not the point. The point is, let's break out of that.
Mm. Oh, I like that. I like that. I like that because then it becomes an entirely different kind of thing, right? Then it becomes this a properly dialogical relationship where it's not as if it doesn't change things. It's not as if prayer doesn't change God, right? I'm like, I have no interest in removing that because, like you said earlier, prayer does change, in at least in the Christian tradition, right? Like prayer changes God all the time, and especially in the Old Testament, like prayer changes God's posture towards things. But that can be the case in a dialogical relationship, and it still not be my invocation of a means to an end, right? In the way that you put it there, it affords a space for both to be true.
Wow, I hadn't thought of that. You're saying that transformative framing that Karst outlines to the silence of God, that we're also connecting to through the beginning of the Our Father, is the space that transforms us. But if it's also invoking dialogue, can transform the other party. And so, like, talking about transforming God is kind of an odd thing to say, but saying essentially like there is something then of change that can happen in the healthiest way into the depths of the real, the depths of beauty and goodness and truth that can then change here, that can then change reality. And I'm not saying here like, oh, that means God goes and does some agentic thing over, but like there is something transformative here that we're identifying.
Yeah. Yes. 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 And I've been in this I've been pursuing, right? I'm constantly seeking for God, right? For to become, one of the ways I say it is to become real. You could call it enlightenment, you could call it whatever you want, right? And there's that constant striving and then realizing to not strive to do it. But one of the things, I realized this the other day, one of the things that I always have kept as like some kind of criteria for like, oh, this, I'll know I've made it when, right? Is some kind of expectation of like being able to do miracles, right? Because Jesus does miracles and then the apostles do miracles. And this is like, so I realized this is so like ingrained in my psyche. And I was noticing that the other day because anyway, and I'm going to hold all of that I said lightly because that's a whole problem with pursuing something. But I think the reason that what we talk about as being miracles is not available to most of us is because we would use them. We would use that power. And it's precisely that Jesus did not contain that power that made it possible. And I think this is another way of saying that, right? This dialogical opening to the other that allows something to shift on both sides, right? On the side of me as an individual and on the side of reality in all its depths. The allowance to shift is predicated on a move that happens from the side of, let's say, the subject that does not set parameters or set expectations on how or what or when or why. Does that make sense?
It does. It very much does. I think this has been very helpful to me to see prayer in this way and to hear your articulation. The sort of invocation of miracles into this still leaves something to me of the intelligibility that has to go all the way down, right? Like that intelligibility is what allows us to live coherent and integrated lives. And so how does that not break the intelligibility? But as long as, like when you said reciprocal opening, essentially, that there is an opening of reality, a disclosing. I mean, here now we're sort of using more Neoplatonic terms of self and reality being disclosed in this way through prayer, that reality is shifting. It's being disclosed, which means I then have new capabilities, which means reality is changing through its disclosure. And I am changing as I am growing. That is really clear to me. And I think that's beautiful. And I've been really helped in that. How that then, like that line of miracles, that agentic line is then, and how does that connect to intelligibility is then, I think, the question that maybe we can talk about next time. If there's, if we can talk again, that would be awesome.
I'm super down. I've been thinking about it a decent bit, but I certainly don't have any answers, but I would love to talk about it again. Ryan, thank you so much for this has been really helpful for me.
Good. Thank you. It's been helpful for me. There's this interesting, to me, when I sort of like picture my Christianity, Christian tradition, there's this glow like a campfire light. And it's sort of like through the woods, and there's people and there's a warmth to it. There's an agapic love kind of thing to it. And then the wisdom practices and the work of Vervaeke is like the light of Galadriel. It's like this searing white, like sharp light that can push back the darkness, and it's transformative. And there's this reconciliation, integration of them in my own life and at large that I would love to see, that like that Christianity can be renewed by what we have learned from other traditions and cognitive science, and the transformative power can be brought in under the narrative of Christ, and that we can bring in the agapic love of God through Christ and merge these. And I feel like that's easy for me to do in Lectio Divina, for instance, right? Like put the Gospels and the Psalms in relation and do that there. I feel like I'm feeling some sense of that merging here with prayer and the other practices. And that's really, really beautiful and beneficial. I was talking to a friend of mine who is just a beautiful person and devout Catholic. And I said, what if I gave you practices that did for you more than what prayer could do? Would you give up prayer for the practices? And he said, never, because it's in this framing of my Heavenly Father and of the love that I receive. And like that framing matters, like even if there's nothing happening supernaturally. And I think there's something really to that we've touched on with the Our Father here. That was really beautiful.
Yes, wonderfully said. And I look forward to more. I think it would be a lot of fun and a possibly dangerous conversation, but a fun one to go into miracles, because that all gets very interesting and strange. But thank you, Ryan. Until next time.